Welcome to episode 3 of the podcast, The Samurai in Our Closet. My name is Mandy Shintani, and similar to my dad's samurai sword that was hidden in our closet, I'm going to retrace the life of my father, George Shintani, to uncover the untold stories of Canadians of Japanese heritage. In the last episode, I traveled in a bus tour to visit the internment camps along with second-generation Japanese Canadians, or Nisei, who had lived through this experience. We went to a ghost mining town called Sandon, where my father was held as a teenager. Join me in this episode where we uncover the stories of my father, who went from enemy alien to working on one of the most significant war crimes in history with the Canadian Intelligence Corps, and we'll find out how he received his samurai sword. Not satisfied with the internment of 22,000 Japanese Canadians and dispossession of all their assets, politicians continue their popular campaign. Here's a statement from Ian McKenzie, a federal minister foreshadowing further loss of rights, read by Garth Taylor.
It is the government's plan to get these people out of BC as fast as possible. It is my personal intention, as long as I remain in public life, to see they never come back here. Let our slogan be for British Columbia, "No Japs from the Rockies to the seas."
Hearing this from politicians, I believe my father sensed there was no future in BC and realized he had to move on. He left Sandon, an internment site which the first generation, or Issei, had turned into a community for the sake of the children. And just as Ian McKenzie threatened, Canadians of Japanese heritage were only able to leave on the condition that they moved east of the Rocky Mountains or went back to Japan. Here is voiceover actor Ewan Craig reading from my father's journal on starting over in Toronto.
Sandon was a great period of my life. And yet I knew it wasn't the real world, and I had to move on. My good friend Kit Kagawa had moved to Toronto earlier and urged me to join him. So I left Sandon on my 18th birthday on December 8th, 1943.
My sister Jay Shintani recalls how my father and Kit as teenagers were only able to afford renting one room.
I don't even know how much money they had, but I just remember Dad said he and Kit had to share a twin bed.
Japanese Canadians again are faced with hostility when they move to other provinces. Pauline Nishino recalls when her parents, who were worried and stressed to find jobs, are finally given an opportunity to work at a laundry plant in Ontario. This is from a recorded interview from the Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre SEDI project.
My dad wanted to come out east, and the war was still on. But Mr. Truman got him a job, my mother and dad, in Aylmer, Ontario. So they went first, and first day of work, the whole plant shut down. They said they were enemy aliens. So they wouldn't go to work.
My mother said that when they got to Toronto, people that were really sympathetic to their cause, that would rent to them or give them jobs, were Jewish people, because Jewish people could sympathize with the Japanese Canadians.
Just as Susan Yatabe, the daughter of a second-generation or Nisei veteran, indicated, even though there was a severe labor shortage due to the war, my father was only able to find dirty and menial work at a tire factory run by a Jewish man. He also worked at Canadian Tire, who did not discriminate against Japanese Canadians. Here's my father from an interview from the Nikkei National Museum.
On work with a guy named Louis Shirkin, who was placing old tires in during the war, and tires are very hard to get. He would rebuild these tires. It's kind of a dirty word. And I'll work at Canadian Tire, rebuilding car generators. He was making 30 cents a generator, making something like $1.50 a day.
My father tries to find a better job at Canadian General Electric and asks why he's not allowed to even fill out an application.
And I said, why can't I? You were advertising for about 12 jobs, and I'm the first one here, so the jobs can't be filled, so why can't I make the application? Well, if we hired you, he says, the veterans won't like it.
Stung by the injustice, but always open to turning the other cheek, ironically, many years after the war is over, my father reapplies to CGE, and he works there for 23 years. Meanwhile, with success happening in the European wars, the war effort was now directed to defeating Japan. The need for Japanese linguists became high priority. Allies, starting with Australia and then Britain, looked to Canada, who had the highest number of Japanese-speaking citizens. They were perplexed as to why Canada would not allow Japanese Canadians to enlist, as they had found no evidence of a security risk, and given that United States had Japanese Americans who had proven their loyalty and valor through units such as the highly decorated 442nd Regiment. Canada has to admit that they interned Japanese Canadians in remote camps in BC, but finally concedes to allowing enlistment after the Allies apply significant pressure, which according to Roy Ito's book, We Went to War, suggests likely included direct communication from Winston Churchill. The young men who enlisted not only had to face some opposition within the Japanese Canadian community, but it created deep divisions within families who had lost and endured so much. Here's what I found out that my Uncle Ray Takeuchi told his son Glenn just before he passed away.
Relatively recently, I found out that my dad had enlisted. His dad was not in favor of that, but I didn't find that out until just before he died, that his father had stopped talking to him. He wouldn't talk to him. He went off to war, and his dad never talked to him after that. My dad felt very strongly about the fact that he was Canadian and that he should do this.
Frank Morisugu recalls his father's reaction to his enlistment. At 102 years old, Frank is the last surviving second-generation or Nisei veteran, read by his son, David Morisugu.
My father said, "How can you fight for a country that treats us like this?" I replied, "Dad, out here in Ontario, there are quite a few people evacuated from BC. And fortunately, we don't experience the ugly racism here that we did in British Columbia." I told my mom and dad, if I enlist and become a Canadian soldier, that would show our neighbors in Eastern Canada that we are 100% Canadian.
While Frank's mother fears for the worst if he is captured by the Japanese army, as described in this story from a recorded interview with the Sedai Project.
I stay up late drinking tea into the night, and finally my mother says, in Japanese, she says, "If you get captured by the Japanese, jisatsu shinasai, kill yourself." This is the Japanese way, you say, right? But anyway, she said, the Japanese will be just like the people in BC. They will not understand that you are a Canadian. They will look at you, and they will treat you much worse than anybody else that they capture at the same time. So, kill yourself. I said, okay, Mom. But it brought home something that, of course, all of us are aware of, that, hell, it's one thing to show that we're Canadians, another thing is to go to war.
In the beginning of 1945, Frank Morisugu and my uncle, Ray Takeuchi, are amongst the first Nisei to enlist and were called the India Group. Japanese Canadians agree to serve in the military, even though Canada will only allow them to serve with the British Intelligence Corps. Later, Canada concedes they can go overseas as members of the Canadian Army. This group of Nisei traveled to India and received training with the British Forces Southeast Asian Command. Besides interrogation and translation, according to the article by Nisei veteran George Tanaka, this group also engages in psychological warfare, radio broadcasting in Myanmar, and were part of an invasion group that landed in Malaysia. Word spreads that Japanese Canadians are now serving in the Canadian Army, and my father has a conversation with a stranger that convinces him to enlist. Read by actor Ewan Craig from my father's journal.
It was during this period at a Greek restaurant on Church Street that I struck up a conversation with a stranger sitting next to me at the counter, and when I told him I was born in Vancouver, he replied, "And so you're a Canadian." It seems such a bland statement now, but it was huge then. To have a Caucasian make that statement made me realize that it is possible to really become and be recognized as a Canadian. It was probably the strongest motivation for me to enlist in the Canadian Army.
I believe my father would have been greatly relieved when he heard his father's reaction to him joining the Army.
Well, my dad he said, you did the right thing. He said, I'm Japanese, but he says, you're a Canadian. It was good to hear him say that.
For my grandmother or Bachan, I imagine she was heartbroken. She had 2 sons from her first husband who had passed away and were living in Japan. In my father's journal, he wrote that his mother prayed that both of her sons would come back from the war, one fighting for Canada and the other for Japan. After learning more about the injustice of the internment from doing this podcast, the one question I keep thinking about is, why would my father, who was only 19, and other young Japanese Canadian men enlist? Here is Linda Kawamoto Reed asking my father this question in an interview conducted at the Nikkei National Museum.
As a group of Japanese Canadians, what was the common reason for enlisting?
I guess the basic reason is to stand up for our right, have that right as a citizen in the country. Manager of the Canadian Tire plant, I was working there with Patterson. And he said, George, he said, I wouldn't enlist in the Army. He said, in 10 years' time, nobody remember what happened to you people. And I said, well, that's probably true. I'll never be able to forget it.
My sister Jay remembers how a policy of the Canadian Army forever changed my father's religion when he enlisted.
They asked what religion he was, and he said Buddhist, and the recruiter said, oh, well, there's no box for Buddhist. And the recruiter said, you know what, we'll put United Church because they accept everybody. So, and it's so funny, right? Because the faith that he followed afterwards, right?
I know, it was just like boom, in an instant, Dad was a very devout, united
I know.
church member, which lasted till the end of his life, till he was 97.
I know.
In April 1945, my father begins his military service alongside 77 other Nisei in a group called S-20, which was attached to the Canadian Intelligence Corps. The S-20 Japanese Language School in Vancouver was the first one established by the Canadian Army to train personnel in Japanese language skills for intelligence purposes. Before heading to Vancouver, they first attended basic training in Brantford, Ontario as Platoon Number 17.
In many ways, I think they were the most intelligent lot of men and the best platoon we ever had at Brantford. They were quick, smart, picked up their work easily, and we never had a deserter among them.
That was a quote from Colonel Corey from the book We Went to War, narrated by Tom Boivin. My father finds himself back in Vancouver to now attend the S-20 Japanese language school. There must have been immense pressure on these young men to complete intelligence training in Japanese, their second language. According to S-20 veteran Min Yatabe, less than 25% had any Japanese language skills. Garth Taylor reads a passage about the school from We Went to War.
The course was an extremely difficult one, and nervous breakdowns among the candidates were not uncommon. Impressive requirements had to be met to qualify for graduation. The students had to be able to conduct an interrogation in the Japanese language, be able to interpret and translate into English any enemy document, and possess a high standard of proficiency in map reading.
However, according to veteran Roy Matsui, the objective for training for Nisei veterans was far beyond just interrogation. He's being interviewed by Lisa Uyeda for the SEDI project.
Once we were shipped to Vancouver for advanced training, which was intelligence training. I think the plan was to take people like us in the Canadian Army and use them as fifth column spies behind the enemy lines. Training was essentially studying Japanese Army tactics, strategy. So we became quite knowledgeable about how the Japanese Army operated.
What kind of tactics did you learn about the Japanese Army when you're studying in the Canadian Army?
Well, I only remember the general things, like how the Army strategized and how they planned their attacks and things like that. It was a pretty tough course.
Spy training? If the Canadian government truly believed Japanese Canadians were a security risk, why did they recruit young Nisei men to be spies and interrogators on top secret files? Even more ironic, 5 Nisei held in Canadian prisoner of war camps in Ontario were assigned into the S-20. The S-20 was an impressive group consisting of Nisei and individuals of diverse backgrounds, united by comradeship that developed into lifelong friendships. Amongst its remarkable members were great Canadians such as Judy LaMarche, who was the second woman ever to serve as federal minister and also became Secretary of State, renowned architect Arthur Erickson, and Tommy Shoyama, editor of the New Canadian newspaper and one of Canada's most influential post-war civil servants. Nisei from both the India Group and the S-20 would also go on to remarkable careers and would play key roles as community organizers and activists. With my father now being stationed in Vancouver, he returns back to his home to see if he can retrieve some of his family's treasured possessions.
My mother had 2 large bronze flower vases left behind, tossed in the backyard. She also had many beautiful, gold-edged dishes which she only used on special occasions. They were packed into wooden boxes and left in the garage owned by a friend. When the army stationed us in Vancouver, I went to the house to ship them back to Toronto. I found the boxes were broken into and dishes smashed, as evident by broken pieces on the floor. I never told my mother. I thought it best that she didn't know.
That was narrated by Ewan Craig. Here is Roy Matsui describing a rare night out during their time back in Vancouver.
We were billeted in Vancouver Technical School, and we were not allowed to leave because we were told we should not be seen outside in public. During that training, we had been confined to barracks there. We were allowed one night out to go wherever we wanted. A lot of us went to try to get into movies. Hadn't seen a movie in ages. And the manager looked at these people wearing Canadian Army uniforms and became alarmed and called the police.
Really?
Thinking that we were the enemy.
I'm reading an article from the Edmonton Journal titled, "This Secret School Had to Hide Its Prize Students." On August 6, 1945, the students of the S-20 Japanese Language School were given 2 recently intercepted Japanese radio transmissions to test their knowledge of Japanese technical terms. The first announcement mentioned a bankudan, meaning big bomb, that had leveled Hiroshima. How could one bomb do that? The next bulletin referred to a genshi bankudan. The students got out their Japanese-English dictionaries. Genshi meant atomic. What's atomic? Then the newspapers began printing the details of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 9 days later, Japan surrendered.
World War II in the Pacific, 4 years of bloody hell, came to an end here. September 2nd, 1945, a solemn ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
With the war over, the military still needed interrogators and interpreters to question Japanese personnel about war crimes. My father decides to stay with the Army, and in February 1946 was sent overseas as part of the second group from the S-20 to work at the South Asian Translation and Interrogation Center. World War II had ended, but the effect of the war had not ended for Japanese Canadians. While my father remained in the military, most Japanese Canadians were still living in the internment sites. Their hopes to return back to the West Coast are completely dashed away with the new act that was implemented under the federal government, as explained by author and Nisei Chuck Tasaka.
The war ended. They could not enforce the War Measures Act. The Japanese Canadians were no longer enemy alien, no longer a threat to national security. So they had to come up with another policy. So that's when the government showed their hands that it was racially motivated. It had nothing to do with the war. So when they gave that ultimatum, go east of the Rockies or Japan, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You knew this was ethnic cleansing. Just get out of BC.
Julie Tamiko Manning, actor and theater creator, describes the trauma of another forced uprooting from the internment sites that Japanese Canadians had turned into their home and community.
What's even more traumatic is that they were ripped from this community that people actually worked really hard to create. And they had Boy Scouts and Canadian Girls in Training. They had judo classes. They had poetry clubs. They had baseball. And then all of a sudden they were ripped away from that again. And they were either moved back to Japan or went east of the Rockies.
Japanese Canadians had put their heart and soul into these towns and not only revitalized them, but brought exceptional craftsmanship for boat building, farming, and as skilled carpenters in restoring historic buildings. Greenwood becomes the one exception where Japanese Canadians can remain after the war. Here is Chuck Tasaka.
He says, we want these Japanese Canadians in our town. Greenwood will be back to square one, 171 odd people, right? A lot of the businesses were owned or operated by Japanese Canadians. So when they leave, what happens?
And the Japanese Canadians wanted to stay.
A lot of them wanted to stay. Out of the 1,200, 800, about 800 stayed. Mayor MacArthur, he wrote a letter stating and compared it to the Acadians being ousted out of Nova Scotia. Mayor MacArthur encouraged the Japanese Canadians to stay in Greenwood. Lemon Creek or Pawpaw, they had no choice. The shacks are going to be sold or torn down. They had to go east of the Rockies or Japan. It's scary, and it's also the uncertainty of going to Toronto or Hamilton, Montreal. Again, another unknown territory. That ones that didn't know anyone, they said, well, we don't know anyone in back east. So they decided to go to Japan.
In 1946, 5 commissioned Navy ships with almost 4,000 Japanese Canadians leave for war-torn and defeated Japan. Here's Chuck again.
A lot of the ones who did choose to go to Japan they had to rely on their relatives, like uncles and aunts and maybe grandparents. But when they went to Japan, they said, "Why are you here? We can't feed our own family. Why are you? We have to feed your family too." So it was really tense.
I am surprised to learn that for many Canadians of Japanese heritage, they described the most difficult time of the internment was when they had to relocate again and move to another province. Here again is Susan Yatabe explaining why.
So when my grandparents left Caslo and they moved to Toronto, they had to start from nothing. And they weren't the only. I think all Japanese that had been interned were in the same boat. They'd lost most of their possessions, they'd lost their employment, and their friends were scattered all around the country. After the war, people didn't want to hire Japanese Canadians or rent rooms, apartments, or homes to them. My uncle wrote to my mother warning her that my grandparents only had $50 in their bank account by the time they got to Toronto.
However, the City of Toronto had policies to bar those of Japanese ancestry from relocating there without sponsorship. Despite these restrictions, some Japanese Canadians managed to settle in Toronto discreetly, sometimes blending in as Chinese Canadians. Back in BC, the population of Canadians of Japanese heritage dwindles from over 23,000 pre-war to only 6,776. Meanwhile, my father is excited to head overseas to start the next chapter of his time with the Canadian Intelligence Corps.
We went from England to North Africa, and then from there we flew to Cairo. We stayed in Cairo about a week there. At nighttime you can see the pyramid and the Sphinx. And after that we were flown to India and went through India, and then Madras we went on to a Liberty ship and we ended up in Malaysia.
My father was also stationed in Thailand, but mostly worked in Singapore.
Singapore was the staging area for them to be shipped back to Japan. A guy named Frank Haley and I were sent to Singapore, and I was assigned to work at Changi Jail, and that's where the prisoners were. My job there was to interrogate prisoners.
According to my father's journal, he spent most of his time most notably with a case where atrocities were committed on the building of the Burma-Siam Railway. He wrote a movie was based on this called The Bridge Over the River Kwai.
You British criminals have been chosen to build a bridge across the River Kwai.
The website History Tools describes the movie as a haunting reminder of one of the darkest chapters of World War II. My friend Pat Chua, a lawyer, is visiting Singapore, and I asked her to do some research on the infamous Changi prison. She is reading information gathered from the Changi Chapel and Museum on the history of the Burma-Siam Railway, now known as Myanmar and Thailand.
The Burma-Siam Railway, or the Death Railway as it was notoriously known as, was a 415-kilometer-long railway built along the River Kwai Valley through dense jungle linking Thailand to Burma. The Japanese army forced about 60,000 Australian, British, Dutch, and American prisoners of war and roughly 200,000 civilians, mostly Burmese and Malayan laborers. The laborers toiled under harsh conditions in shifts lasting up to 18 hours and were subject to brutal punishments from their Japanese overseers. Due to the squalid conditions and meager rations, many laborers rapidly fell victim to virulent diseases and malnutrition. By the time the railway was finished in October 1943, nearly 100,000 prisoners of war and laborers had lost their lives. After the war, it was the Japanese who was interned in Changi prison. The prison was used by the British to hold Japanese prisoners of war.
Cameron Walker, grandson of Kit Kitagawa, reading from his journal about a task not enjoyed by the Nisei called blacking.
During this time, our duty was to interrogate Japanese surrendered army personnel being repatriated back to Japan. We would interrogate a soldier against blacklists provided, and it was not a pretty sight to watch over a defeated army. We screened in 7 days on average between 1,500 Japanese personnel a day. I matched one soldier to the list, and I heard he took his life in detention.
Glenna Toyer, daughter of Nisei veteran Shigeru Oe, describes her perspective on her father's role as interrogator.
I think it was a difficult job and emotionally very taxing because you're dealing with very serious consequences for the people involved. In a letter to my mom, he had said that it was very trying on a person's nerves.
In my search for the children of Nisei veterans, I found they were told, like me, that their fathers were simply translators or interpreters within the Canadian Army. Here's part of my conversation with Glenna Toyer and my sister Claire.
What did you think your dad was doing in the Army?
Oh, I thought he was translating, but I thought it might be like you found this document and then you're writing it out in English. I didn't really understand the issues of interrogation and war crimes, and I had no idea about all that kind of stuff.
How do you feel about the work that your dad actually did?
I admire their courage and their attitude, their spirit.
Well, we were always told he was an interpreter, which is much more acceptable than an interrogator. I think that sounds a little bit heavier. It's a little bit darker. And then there's more responsibility, right? Like he's the one asking the life and death questions, right? They have consequences. He's hearing these unspeakable acts. They were young men, but they were still almost boys, right? And when I look back in contrast with what I was doing at that age, like I was working in a mall, at Fabricland, and here Dad is doing this thing that has so much responsibility, and the contrast.
One of the unexpected outcomes while my father was serving overseas was receiving a sacred 400-year-old samurai sword. This was the sword that was hidden in our closet for most of my father's life. In the recorded interview with the Nikkei National Museum, my father explained that when he was stationed in Indonesia, there was a Japanese Army medical unit that had hid their samurai swords amongst their medical supplies. However, as they were being sent back to Japan as surrendered personnel, they realized they had to surrender their swords. Here's my father describing the day he received his samurai sword.
But now they're being sent back, individually back to Japan. They knew they couldn't take the swords. They called us over. They gave each of us a sword.
You still have it?
Oh, yes. Wow. My sword is how many years old? It's about 400 years old now.
So that soldier was a descendant of a samurai?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
I contacted Tom Helm, president of the Northern California Japanese Sword Club, to explain the question I received the most. Why did the Japanese Army bring these ancient samurai swords that were family heirlooms?
So we have to go back in history. In 1868, the government by samurai was displaced by a government led by the Emperor Meiji, or Bushi, was outlawed. So many families gave up wearing swords altogether. But you had a new military which was being built on a Western European model. Officers carried swords. They carried long swords, and it was a badge of their rank. They were machine-made Western-style sabers. Very quickly, the officers who had samurai background figured out that you could modify a traditional sword to fit the military scabbard and handle, and therefore you could carry a family heirloom as a badge of your rank. Among modern armies in the Second World War, and the modern soldiers saw themselves as sort of carrying on the traditions of their bouquet ancestors.
I asked Tom to explain what the samurai sword symbolized for Japanese army officers who carried these family heirlooms into war, and what it meant to surrender after Japan was defeated.
The sword had always been, for the samurai, a badge of justice. They're very proud to own a symbol that they would strive very hard to live up to. And if it was something that was carried by your father and your grandfather and his father before him, then it carried a great deal of significance for those family members.
Oh, wow.
Something of the spirit of those individuals was carried within the sword. For a Japanese soldier, surrendering was essentially forfeiting your life. It was a difficult thing to sort of be reborn and come back and have to try to resume your old life and not feel shame for having lost.
My sister Claire and I reflect on what our dad may have thought about the sword after receiving it.
I always felt like he thought he was just the custodian of that sword. He wasn't the owner of that sword. He was always searching for a home for it. And I think that's why it was never displayed. It was never really ours. Mm-hmm. Did you feel that too? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. I always felt like Dad thought it was something that was taken during a time of war. Felt like he could never financially benefit from it. That didn't seem right to him.
No, he just wanted to find someone that would take care of it and honor it. Well, he knew how important it would have been to that family.
In my father's journal, he talks about long periods of time when there was nothing to do. He tries to go swimming at a posh club in Singapore that allows soldiers to use the pool for 1 day a week, but is refused. Here's my father discussing this with the club manager.
Are you trying to tell me that I can't come here and use the pool? And he said, yes. So I said, why? I'm in the Canadian Army attached to the British, so why can't I use it? Do you know what he said? He said it'd be a bad example to the natives. I laughed right away. And here are these guys that fought through the Burma campaign, risking their lives and getting wounded. They weren't going to allow them to use a pool. So after that, I never did go back.
When my father reports this incident of racism, his commanding officer, to my surprise, is just as angry. It's clear that the Nisei in the S-20 formed strong, lasting friendships and had fun, not just with other Japanese Canadians, but with his peers and superiors of diverse backgrounds. Here's a journal entry from Frank Haley, who served with my father, read by his brother, actor Bob Haley.
Ferdy and AJ had a spot of this and that, and then danced and sang with the best of them. Even did the Russian dancing. Drake fell through a jetty and into the canal. Almost lost the truck looking for his shoe using the truck's lights. Retired in good order.
Despite the comradeship, for men with families, they were often desperate to return home to their wives and children. Here is Laureen Oikawa reading a letter her uncle Buck Suzuki wrote to his wife.
I wanted to go home more than anything else, but there is still unfinished work here, and I'm afraid we might undo what good we have done by leaving now. I'm a sucker or a dreamer, but I feel I have to carry on a little longer. I wanted all of us, all Nisei, to be able to hold our heads up high when we walk the streets after the war.
Shigeru Oe from the S-20 was also reminded of home when he was stationed in Japan and unexpectedly encounters a girl he once knew from Canada. Shigeru did interrogation work before the surrendered Japanese personnel were returned back to Japan. He was then transferred to Japan to do court interpreting and act as a liaison between the British field security officers and the Japanese police. Here again is his daughter, Glenna Toyer.
He was shocked one night to meet a Nisei girl whom he had known in Vancouver and who had been repatriated to Japan, working in a cabaret as a prostitute. When their eyes met, they were both embarrassed, and she turned away with an exaggerated air of not giving a damn. So I think it was an embarrassing encounter, and it was, to me, so sad that the evacuated Japanese Canadians had to suffer in this consequences of their so-called repatriation. It obviously wasn't a repatriation, but to be reduced to having to become a prostitute to survive, because Japan, they had no money, they had nothing. Horrible.
Meanwhile, back in Singapore, my father continues to work on war crime trials, and he describes the cruelty of the Japanese army, but also feels conflicted and has compassion in his role as an interpreter and interrogator.
The Japanese army was really cruel. For instance, when they captured Singapore, they rounded up, I don't know just how many, but ones they thought might possibly give them a problem. And they took them out to the beach there, made them dig their own grave, and then they machine gunned them. They call it the Singapore Massacre Trial. Mm-hmm. And I think it was 2 colonels that found guilty, and they were given a death sentence. Yeah, it's just the way that Japanese army is run. The officers will belittle the junior officers, and they in turn will belittle those below them too, right? So the common soldier, he goes and takes it on the prisoners.
So, in spite of the cruelty that happened, it sounds like you had a bit of compassion.
Yes.
You're conflicted there. So, can you tell me more about that?
Well, as far as I was concerned, I was just doing my duty, and my job was to try to get as much truth about what happened.
Here's my father recalling a Japanese prisoner of war who asked for permission to take his cigarette butts during an interrogation.
I know one time when I was interviewing this guy, and I smoked a cigarette, and I butted my cigarette. And when I was finished with him, he asked me if he can pick up the butts. So I says no, I gave him a couple of new ones, and I don't think Major Horn was too impressed with that.
My father was focused on his task to find the truth for the war crimes trials. But I believe by this story, he didn't see all Japanese soldiers as evil or enemies, just as he understood that Canadians of Japanese heritage were not enemy aliens in Canada. Once again, here's Pat Chua with the outcome of the war crimes trial related to the bridge over the River Kwai.
The British held 131 trials in Singapore, with Changi Prison serving both as a detention area for those who were waiting trial and as the site of one of the courts for the tribunals. At the end of World War II, 111 Japanese military officials were tried for war crimes for their brutality during the construction of the Burma-Siam Death Railway. 32 of them were sentenced to death.
And those prisoners were executed in Changi Jail, and they used to hang in 2 at a time. I never went to witness it, but I used to hear them. You'd be shouting, "Banzai," and you can hear the traps coming. And later on, they used to bring in the bodies to our interrogation rooms. The medical officers there and sign the death notes strip cut. So I used to see the bodies there.
After witnessing some horrific events, I asked Janet Haley, the daughter of veteran Frank Haley, on her perspective of why the S-20 did not lose their faith in humanity working in war crimes.
I'm amazed, working in war crimes, that is the worst of the worst. And yet he never lost his faith in humanity. And that's where I credit the people that he was with. So all of our dads, they must have been really good at supporting each other.
My brother-in-law, Phil Brereton, reflects on my father's wartime experience.
I mean, you know, in war, people are expected to kill one another. Terrible things happen in war, but these were war crimes. People were tortured, starved to death. People were worked to death. The surprising thing is you would think these stories would have scarred him, but he seemed to be able to just put it all in a box. George understood what the worst of humanity was capable of, but he was able to remain positive about the best humanity could offer. Yeah, George was an optimist.
On May 16, 1947, my father returns home by ship, and according to Janet Haley, he was lucky to have returned home with his samurai sword.
So my dad took his and he got a permit for that sword. But as they're lined up to get on the boat to come back to Canada, somebody hadn't done their paperwork. They're told you have to have this paperwork or you can't take it into Canada. They threw the swords overboard. And my dad says it's so awful to think this would have been real samurai swords rusting on the bottom of the ocean.
Here's my father reflecting on his samurai sword.
A real treasure as far as I'm concerned.
You know, the long history of the warrior Bushido thing in Japan, culminating with being charged for war crimes and then you going home with this sword, they're really very symbolic. So I'm not surprised that it's a treasure for you.
If I find a right home for it, I will give it up.
I'm looking at my father's discharge papers from the Department of National Defense. Interesting note, he received $367 for 774 days of service. I always wondered, did my father have any regrets? Until I heard his comments from his interview with Linda Kawamoto Reed.
Do you have any nightmares? Did you have trouble sleeping when you got back?
No, I don't have any problem. I feel certainly a lot better for going into the Army. Because I don't think anybody can tell me that I'm not a Canadian. I think that's a big thing for me. That I know where I belong. And nobody can make any remarks about that.
Upon returning home, Japanese Canadian veterans continued to fight for the right to vote and return to their homeland in BC. However, these rights were not granted until 1949, 4 years after the end of World War II. After the war, many Nisei veterans went on to remarkable careers, and many continued to contribute to Canada. During the Cold War era, my father and uncle were involved in top-secret missions. My father worked for National Defense on the Distance Early Warning Line, or DEW line, in the remote Arctic, looking for Russian spies. Meanwhile, my uncle, veteran Ray Takeuchi, worked for Avro Canada, helping to develop the Avro car model. I'd like to dedicate this episode to remembering the courageous men and women who have served Canada. Please join us every year on November 11th at the Japanese Canadian War Memorial in Stanley Park. Here is the last post performed by bugler Bombardier Genevieve Schwartzbach. Thank you for listening to episode 3 of The Samurai in Our Closet. Please join me for the last episode 4, where I will reflect on the philosophy of the first and second generation during the internment, how their actions impacted my generation and our children. We will also discover how Canadians of Japanese heritage are recovering our amazing stories and celebrating our heritage through art, books, museums, and monuments. And you'll find out where you can visit my father's 400-year-old samurai sword. The Samurai in Our Closet was produced by me, Mandy Shintani. The podcast editor was Claude Tanabe, with script editing by Lori Hirata and research by Susan Yatabe. We gratefully acknowledge the support of the Community Fund of the Japanese Canadian Legacies Society and the dedication of our podcast committee members, Tom Boivin, Kim Walker, Phil Burton, Graham Watts, and my sisters Jay and Claire Shintani. Special thanks as well to everyone I interviewed. Your stories made this podcast possible.